A racist police officer brazenly spat at a black woman in a diner, merely because of her skin color and the unfounded accusation that she was obstructing the flow of the line. However, when the woman's identity was revealed, the officer was stunned into silence, and the truth turned the situation completely on its head. This is a story of transformation, remorse, and how a community came together to rebuild trust. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more gripping, unforgettable stories. It was a rainy morning in Montgomery, Alabama. Raindrops pattered on the tin roof of Rosie's Diner, a well-loved spot for locals and truck drivers alike. The aroma of fried eggs, bacon, and fresh coffee filled the air, blending with the hum of chatter and the faint creak of an old ceiling fan. George Miller, a 48-year-old police officer, sat in a corner booth holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His wrinkled face was drawn into a scowl, a reflection of a man accustomed to asserting control with authority and rigidity. George was the kind of person who demanded everything be done his way, and didn't hesitate to show displeasure if anyone disrupted his sense of order. The diner's door swung open, and Elizabeth Carter, a woman in her early 40s, stepped inside. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, she carried herself with confidence and poise. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her natural authority turned heads as she entered. George immediately felt a sense of discomfort. To him, Elizabeth's presence seemed out of place in the simplicity of the diner. As she stood at the counter, scanning the menu with focused attention, George glared at her with irritation. In his mind, she was obstructing the flow of the line, slowing down the rhythm of what he already considered a busy life. "Get a move on, lady," George barked, his voice cold and laced with annoyance, shattering the lively hum of the diner. Elizabeth's eyes calmly turned toward him, unfazed by his rudeness. Her composed but resolute demeanor subtly hinted that this confrontation would not unfold as simply as George's usual outbursts. George pushed his coffee cup aside, his gaze piercing into Elizabeth with clear dissatisfaction. His voice rose, unapologetic and cutting. "How long are you planning to stand there? Hurry up, some of us have things to do." George's sharp words sliced through the previously cordial atmosphere of the diner. A few people stopped what they were doing, their eyes a mix of curiosity and concern. George, long accustomed to using authority and brute force to dominate others, showed no hesitation. To him, Elizabeth was just another ordinary woman, unworthy of any courtesy. Elizabeth slowly turned around, her gaze sharp yet composed. She didn't rush to respond, but locked eyes with George as if deliberating her next move. Her voice, calm but commanding, broke the tension. "Sir, I believe you just crossed the line." Her simple yet weighty reply caused an unusual silence to settle over the diner. George leaned back in his chair, his broad shoulders straining against his uniform. His arrogant posture and condescending glare only escalated the tension. "Cross the line?" George scoffed, standing abruptly, his height and build towering over Elizabeth as if to intimidate her. "Do you even know who you're talking to? I'm George Miller, and I don't have time to argue with someone holding up the line like you." Elizabeth didn't flinch, her steady eyes meeting George's with unshaken calm. She didn't need to say anything further, as George's next move spoke volumes. In a moment of lost control, he spat on the floor at her feet, the sharp sound reverberating in the heavy silence of the diner. A wave of disapproval swept through the room. Nearby diners couldn't conceal their shock. One man muttered, "He's lost it." A few people discreetly reached for their phones, their cameras capturing the unfolding scene. Elizabeth didn't react immediately. She glanced down, then slowly lifted her head, a flash of cold resolve in her eyes. Without a word, she pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and spoke briefly. "It's me. I need to see you right away." She walked out, her stride firm and purposeful, as though she had just closed the chapter on this confrontation. Behind her, George sat back down, picking up his coffee cup with a smirk. "Drama queen," he muttered, while the heavy silence continued to hang over the diner. The other patrons were still reeling. They knew this was no mere petty argument. Someone whispered, "He just made a big mistake." The eyes of the patrons lingered on the door that had just closed behind Elizabeth. In one corner of the diner, a timid customer slowly lowered their phone. The video capturing the entire incident had been recorded in vivid detail. George Miller's. Shouting, Elizabeth Carter's calm yet resolute demeanor, and George's crude act of spitting. It didn't take long for the video to surface on social media, accompanied by a provocative headline, "Police Officer Harasses Black Woman in Diner." The video spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Thousands of views, shares, and comments erupted within hours. Viewers, even without knowing the full context, couldn't help but feel outraged by George's actions. "This is exactly why we need transparency in law enforcement." One comment read, "It's unacceptable for someone in uniform to behave like this," another person wrote. However, not everyone agreed. A few comments attempted to defend George. "This video only shows part of the story. Who knows what she said before this? People always see things one-sided." But the supportive comments for George were quickly drowned out by the tidal wave of public criticism. For the majority, the image of a police officer spitting at a black woman's feet in a public diner was indefensible. The incident didn't remain confined to social media. Local news outlets quickly picked up the story, making it the centerpiece of evening broadcasts. Television stations replayed the video repeatedly, paired with discussions about the broader issues the incident represented: abuse of power within the police force and the strained relationships between law enforcement and the community. Meanwhile, at the Montgomery Police Department, the incident had become the subject of heated discussion. George, still unaware of the storm brewing outside, sat at his desk with a nonchalant demeanor, as if nothing had happened. He recounted the event to his colleagues, twisting it into a humorous, self-aggrandizing tale. "Who does she think she is? A woman trying to play power games? I just made it clear who's in charge." However, George's smug smile didn't last long. One by one, his colleagues began receiving messages, emails, and calls from friends, family, or the media, asking about the incident. A tense atmosphere started to ripple through the department, but George chose to ignore it, reassuring himself that the uproar would blow over soon. But then, heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed down the hallway, signaling the arrival of a true storm. Captain Robert Taylor, his face flushed with anger, appeared at the office door, glaring directly at George. "Miller, in my office, now." As the office door slammed shut behind him, George sat across from Captain Robert Taylor, his gaze avoiding the laptop replaying the viral video. Taylor's face was cold and stern, but deep down, he recognized some of the reasons that had shaped the man George Miller had become. George Miller wasn't born a bad person. A painful past had gradually molded him into the bitter and abrasive man he is today. Years ago, when George was a teenager living in a modest neighborhood in Montgomery, his father, a kind-hearted truck driver, was murdered during an armed robbery. The culprits were a group of black youths. At just 14 years old, George witnessed his mother collapse in grief, sobbing beside his father's simple coffin, a pain that left an indelible mark on his soul. His father's death not only inflicted a profound sense of loss, but also planted the seeds of prejudice in George's mind. To him, the perpetrators weren't just criminals, they symbolized a broader threat from the black community. George's teenage years were consumed by anger and resentment, and neither his family nor his community could help him overcome these feelings. As he grew older, George decided to join the police force, driven by a desire to impose justice on what he viewed as wrong. But instead of becoming a fair protector, he carried his unresolved trauma and deep-seated biases into his work. His encounters on the job, especially with minority communities, only reinforced his distorted views. On top of this, George's personal life was far from stable. A failed marriage left him bitter. His wife, after years of enduring his emotional distance and harsh demeanor, left him and took their only son. Now, George lived alone in a barren apartment, with no close friends and no family by his side. The pressures of his job, combined with the disappointments of his personal life, made George increasingly difficult and inflexible. He no longer saw the humanity in the individuals he encountered on the job, only the stereotypes he had built in his mind over the years. In the office, as Taylor demanded an explanation for his actions, George could only muster a feeble excuse. "She was just an unruly woman. I was just doing my job." But Taylor wasn't letting him off the hook so easily. "Your job? Do you think the job of a police officer is to spit on a woman, regardless of her skin color?" George fell silent. At that moment, images of his father flooded his mind, intertwined with memories of the diner incident earlier that morning. But instead of recognizing his mistake, George felt cornered. To him, Elizabeth Carter wasn't just a woman. She symbolized a challenge to everything he had come to believe. Taylor stared directly at George, exhaling deeply. "You didn't just disgrace yourself. You've disgraced this entire police department. And the worst part? The woman you just insulted is Elizabeth Carter, the newly appointed chief of police for Montgomery." The words hit George like a lightning bolt. He stared at Taylor, his expression shifting from shock to panic. Memories from his past surged back, but this time they weren't a justification. They were a stark reminder that his pain and prejudices had driven him to the brink of collapse. The atmosphere in the office felt suffocating after Captain Robert Taylor's words. George Miller sat frozen, his eyes wide as he processed the name Elizabeth Carter. He struggled to piece everything together in his mind, but the truth was too swift and too clear. "What?" George stammered, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "You mean, she's—" Taylor slammed his hand on the desk, cutting George off mid-sentence. His eyes burned with anger, laced with a trace of disappointment. "Yes, she's Elizabeth Carter, the new chief of police for Montgomery, and she starts her job tomorrow." The words hit George like a blow to the chest. He sat motionless, his throat dry. Elizabeth Carter, the woman he had publicly humiliated in front of an entire diner, wasn't just an ordinary citizen. She was his soon-to-be superior, the one who would oversee the entire police department. Taylor continued, his tone heavy with frustration. "Do you understand that your actions didn't just insult her, but tarnish the reputation of this entire department? That video is spreading everywhere. News outlets are airing it. Community organizations are demanding answers, and this department is being dragged through the mud by the entire city." George tried to defend himself, but his words came out jumbled and incoherent. I didn't know. I just thought she... Taylor cut him off again, unwilling to entertain excuses. "Thought she... What, George? She was a woman standing in line like everyone else and you spat at her feet. That wasn't just wrong, it was despicable." Each word felt like a dagger to George's pride. Deep down, he knew Taylor was right. He had crossed a line, letting his anger and prejudices dictate his actions. Taylor leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together, studying George for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you understand what this means, George? This is your career. This isn't just a reprimand or a note in your file. This could be the end, if she decides it is. And frankly, I wouldn't blame her if that's what she chose." George tried to steady himself, but his hands trembled. He couldn't fathom the idea of his decades-long career ending like this. Yet he also had no idea how to salvage the situation. Taylor stood, his gaze fixed on George. "She'll be here in the morning. If I were you, I'd prepare an apology. Not because you're being forced to, but because it's the right thing to do. But remember, it's not up to me anymore. Everything now depends on her." George left the office in silence, his steps heavy. He felt an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. In his mind, Elizabeth Carter's image loomed larger than ever, not as the woman he had insulted, but as a storm about to upend his entire life. That night, George sat alone in his barren apartment, his eyes glued to his phone screen, where the video continued to spread. He couldn't sleep, unable to shake the growing unease gnawing at him. He knew that tomorrow would be a defining day, not just for his career but for everything he had believed in and stood for until now. The next morning, the atmosphere at the Montgomery Police Department was especially tense. Quick footsteps, hushed whispers, and the cautious glances of officers all pointed to one event: Elizabeth Carter's first official day as chief of police. George Miller stood in a corner of the hallway, a strange unease gnawing at him. He had barely slept the night before, playing out countless scenarios in his mind. Yet, even in his worst imaginings, he hadn't been able to prepare for the reality of facing Elizabeth again. The main doors swung open and Elizabeth entered. Dressed in a crisp, brand-new police uniform, she exuded strength without arrogance. Her steady stride, sharp gaze, and calm expression silenced the room completely. This wasn't someone here to assert dominance. She was a true leader, radiating confidence and a clear sense of purpose. Elizabeth stopped at the podium, her gaze sweeping across the packed room. No one dared to make a sound. After a brief pause, she began. "Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Carter, and as of today, I will be serving as the chief of police for Montgomery." Her voice was clear, every word delivered like a sharp blade cutting through the heavy silence. Without raising her voice, Elizabeth commanded the undivided attention of everyone in the room. "I am here with one goal," she continued, "to restore trust, ensure accountability, and uphold the dignity of every citizen we serve. Our job is not just to enforce the law, but to build a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and treated fairly." Near the back of the room, George stood with his hands clenched at his sides. He felt Elizabeth's gaze sweep over him, if only for a split second, but it was enough to make him feel exposed in front of all his colleagues. Elizabeth paused, leaving a brief silence before concluding her address. "This will not be an easy task, but I believe that with the commitment of everyone in this room, we can create change. Responsibility is not a burden. It is an opportunity to be better." Her final words echoed with power and meaning, striking a chord with many in the room. A few nodded in agreement, while others maintained stoic expressions. Yet it was undeniable that Elizabeth Carter had brought a new wave of energy and a significant challenge to the entire department. As the meeting ended and officers began to leave, Elizabeth remained. She stepped down from the podium, walking slowly through the rows of seats, exchanging glances with each person she passed. When she reached George, he felt his breath catch in his throat. Elizabeth stopped briefly in front of him, her eyes serious but devoid of hostility. She looked directly at him, long enough for him to feel the weight of her gaze. "Good morning, Officer Miller," she said, her tone light but layered with meaning. George simply nodded, too unsure of himself to speak. He felt as though every eye in the room was on him. As Elizabeth moved on, a mix of shame and unease washed over him. Standing in the large but oppressive office, George knew that this wasn't just Elizabeth's first day. It was also the beginning of his reckoning, the moment he would truly have to face the consequences of his actions. The day after her compelling speech, Elizabeth Carter wasted no time. From her very first day, she began implementing a series of reforms she believed would not only improve the Montgomery Police Department, but also rebuild the fractured trust within the community. Her approach was direct and uncompromising. A detailed plan was distributed to every department in the force, outlining 3 key pillars: de-escalation training, the establishment of a community oversight committee, and revisions to internal disciplinary policies. Elizabeth initiated mandatory training sessions for all personnel, emphasizing the use of communication skills over force or intimidation in tense situations. These sessions were not limited to theory but included realistic scenarios, requiring officers to practice navigating complex situations. "Our job isn't just about enforcing the law," Elizabeth emphasized during a meeting. "It's about understanding and connecting with people. Every word, every action we take has the power to either diffuse or ignite tension." George Miller attended the first training session reluctantly. Sitting at the back of the room, arms crossed and frequently checking his watch, he simmered with quiet resentment. To him, these sessions felt like a subtle humiliation, targeting veteran officers like himself, who had long relied on authority to resolve issues. To ensure transparency, Elizabeth established a community oversight committee composed of representatives from various demographics. This committee's role was to review complaints about police behavior and contribute input on significant departmental decisions. Initially, this idea faced fierce opposition from many officers, including George. "We're letting civilians control the police now?" he exclaimed angrily during a meeting. Elizabeth responded with calm firmness. "Yes, Officer Miller, we work for the community, and they have the right to oversee how we do our jobs." Her reply left George feeling deeply insulted, but he had no counterargument. One of Elizabeth's boldest moves was revising the department's internal disciplinary policy to ensure that all misconduct, regardless of rank or tenure, would be addressed with strict accountability. George was among the first to feel the weight of this policy. After reviewing the diner incident, Elizabeth issued a decisive punishment. George was placed on suspension, stripped of active duty responsibilities, and required to participate in a community outreach program as a form of reparative action. When George learned of this decision, he stormed into Elizabeth's office, so furious he nearly slammed his fist on her desk. "You're trying to humiliate me in front of the entire department," he shouted. Elizabeth held his gaze steadily and replied calmly, "No, Officer Miller, you did that yourself. I'm simply ensuring your actions don't go ignored." To George, participating in the community outreach program felt like a public disgrace. He was tasked with working directly with youth groups in neighborhoods he previously knew only through arrests. In the early days, his attitude was reluctant. He showed up with a stiff demeanor, making no effort to hide his dissatisfaction. The reactions from the community, especially the teenagers, only deepened his frustration. "What would a cop like you know about our lives?" one boy said bluntly, his eyes filled with defiance. George had no answer. For the first time in years, he felt the chasm he had unknowingly created between himself and the people he was supposed to protect. Each passing day did little to quell George's frustration, but the questions from the teens and the skeptical glances from the community began to sow seeds of doubt in his mind, thoughts he had never allowed himself to confront before. Unbeknownst to him, the program he viewed as punishment was slowly laying the groundwork for a profound transformation within him. In the early days of the community outreach program, George Miller felt like a stranger in a foreign world. He found himself in predominantly black neighborhoods, where the skeptical gazes of residents felt like invisible knives cutting into his pride. At gatherings, George maintained a hardened exterior, but this only deepened the divide between him and the community. When he walked into a community center, whispers quickly spread, "That's him, the cop from the video. Does he think a few charity events will make up for what he's done?" During a life skills workshop for teenagers, George stood before a group of kids, his face cold and expressionless. He spoke about traffic safety, but his words seemed to go in one ear and out the other. A boy, around 12 years old with defiant eyes, stood up and asked loudly, "Why should we listen to you? People like you don't care about us." The question left George speechless. He tried to find a response but couldn't utter a word. In the silence that followed, the children's eyes seemed to pierce through his hardened exterior. It wasn't just the children. Adults in the community also rejected George's presence. A group of residents organized a small meeting at the community center, demanding that he be removed from the program. A middle-aged woman stood up and said, "We don't need an officer like him teaching our kids. He's only doing this because he's being forced to, not because he truly cares." Her words, though not shouted, carried immense weight. George tried to remain composed, but a sense of helplessness he had never experienced before began to take hold of him. In the days that followed, similar encounters repeated, and George began to realize the extent of the harm he had caused this community, not just from the diner incident, but from years of carrying his prejudices into his work. He started to recall moments when he had been unnecessarily harsh with members of the black community, decisions he had made not based on the reality of the situation, but on mistrust and defensiveness. These memories no longer filled him with a sense of power, but with shame and regret. One evening, after finishing his work at the community center, George sat alone on a park bench nearby. The dim yellow glow of street lights highlighted the deep lines on his aged face. He looked around and saw families laughing and children playing, and realized he had never truly understood these people. "What have I done?" he murmured, admitting for the first time that his actions and beliefs had made him part of the very problem he thought he was addressing. As George slowly began to connect with the community, he remained unaware that, behind the scenes, a group of officers opposing Elizabeth's reforms were plotting to sabotage the outreach program. Tom Briggs and Ryan Carter, leading the opposition, saw George's involvement in the program as an unnecessary humiliation. In a private conversation in the police department's parking lot, Tom said to Ryan, "You've seen George. He's like a dog on a leash now, doing whatever Elizabeth tells him. We can't let her think she's running the show." Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with agreement. Exactly. If George fails, she fails too. Despite their plans, George felt a small glimmer of hope within himself. He didn't know if he could truly redeem himself, but for the first time, he genuinely wanted to try. Not because he was being forced, but because he realized it was the right thing to do. The opposition group began their sabotage by forging key program documents. One day, when George arrived at the community center for a meeting with the program's management, he was handed an official report from the police department. It stated that funding for the program had been cut due to low effectiveness. Confused, but not daring to question the document's validity, George tried to explain to the community members that the program might need to be paused. The room immediately erupted in anger. A woman stood up, pointing directly at George. "You said you'd changed, that you were here to help. But it's all lies. You cops never actually care about us." George stood there in silence, overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness. Deep down, he knew this wasn't true of the effort he had been making. Yet the situation left him struggling to prove otherwise. When Elizabeth received information about the incident, she immediately called an internal meeting to investigate. After a thorough review, she discovered that the documents had been altered, and the trail led directly to Tom and Ryan. Without hesitation, Elizabeth confronted the two. In her office, she looked directly at Tom, her voice cold but filled with authority. "Do you think sabotaging from within will help you maintain power? You haven't just betrayed me, you've betrayed the very community we swore to protect." Tom tried to justify his actions. "We were only doing what was necessary to preserve the traditions of this department." Elizabeth cut him off. "Traditions? If tradition means irresponsibility and prejudice, then it's something that must change, and you will face the consequences of your actions." Once the truth came to light, Elizabeth not only restored trust in the community, but also met with George to inform him. "I know this situation has undermined your efforts," she said, her voice calm yet filled with empathy. "But this wasn't your fault, and I need you to keep going. This community still needs you." Though George felt anger toward his former colleagues, he also felt the trust Elizabeth placed in him. Determined, he resolved to prove that the program was not just a punishment, but an opportunity for him to make amends and rebuild trust on both sides. This incident not only solidified Elizabeth's leadership, but also served as a challenge for George to continue demonstrating his transformation. In the weeks that followed, he worked harder than ever, not just with the community, but also with younger officers, inspiring them to see their role through a new lens, as a force that truly serves and protects everyone. The days working in the community outreach program continued to bring countless challenges, but with each passing day, George Miller felt a small but steady shift in his perspective. The distance and skepticism from the community remained, yet he began to notice the individuals he had once only seen through the lens of prejudice. One afternoon, on his way back from the community center, George heard a child's panicked scream. He turned to see a black boy, around 10 years old, struggling as his bicycle spun out of control, careening down a slope toward a busy street. Without hesitation, George dropped his bag and ran. With the instincts of a seasoned patrol officer, he sprinted through a narrow alley and managed to grab the boy just seconds before the bike shot out into traffic. The boy, trembling with fear, clung tightly to George. Gasping for breath, George placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "It's okay. You're safe now." A few neighborhood residents had witnessed the scene, and for the first time, their eyes on George no longer brimmed with suspicion. That incident marked a turning point for George, not just because he had saved a child's life, but because for the first time he understood the true meaning of protecting and connecting with the community. The next day, George arrived at the community center with a different attitude. He no longer approached his tasks as mere obligations, but began actively seeking opportunities to help and listen. He immersed himself in activities with the children, teaching life skills, organizing basketball games, and taking time to speak with each child individually. Their stories, about their struggles, dreams, and fears, revealed to George what he had missed throughout his career. seeing the humanity behind every situation. One afternoon, as George was helping a group of kids with their math homework, a young girl of about 9 suddenly stopped writing and looked at him intently. Her gaze was both curious and serious. "Are you changing?" she asked softly, her words carrying more weight than George had expected. He paused for a moment, feeling the honesty in her question. Setting his pen down, he looked her in the eye and answered sincerely, "Yes, I'm trying." She nodded, as if carefully considering his response. "Good, because we're watching you," she added, her tone carrying a touch of playful teasing. George smiled, but he knew her words were no joke. They were a reminder that change couldn't be superficial. It had to come from within, from the smallest actions taken every day. From that moment on, George felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He no longer viewed the community outreach work as punishment, but as an opportunity to mend relationships with the people he had unintentionally hurt. George's transformation wasn't the result of one defining moment, but rather a series of small acts, helping a child with homework, organizing a basketball game, and listening to the stories of others. One afternoon, while volunteering at the community center, an unexpected event sparked strong emotions. A group of residents organized a meeting to assess the program's progress. George stood quietly at the edge of the room, tempering his expectations. When an elderly woman, one who had openly opposed him, stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. She paused for a moment, looking around before speaking. "At first, I didn't believe in him. I thought he was only here because he was forced to be, not because he cared. But over time, I've seen George Miller truly change. He's not just helping the kids, he's listening to us, understanding us. And that cannot be faked." Her heartfelt words sent a powerful wave of emotion through the room. A young man stood up, his voice filled with gratitude. "I used to think cops like you only cared about power, but now I know you're someone who's trying for us. Thank you, George." The room erupted into applause, louder and longer than George had ever expected. He stood there, feeling his eyes sting with tears. For the first time, he truly believed he could atone for his past mistakes. Each day, George realized he wasn't just changing how he viewed the community, he was also healing the wounds within himself. And with every step forward, George began to believe that, even if it was late, he still had the chance to become the person he had always hoped to be. As George Miller gradually found peace in his community outreach work, a quiet undercurrent of unrest was building within the Montgomery Police Department. Elizabeth Carter's bold reforms had brought positive changes, but not everyone was ready to accept them. A small group of veteran officers who had worked with George for years grew increasingly uncomfortable with the changes Elizabeth was implementing. To them, these reforms not only disrupted their established routines, but also threatened their authority and standing within the force. In hushed conversations, this group began voicing their discontent, not just about the new policies, but about Elizabeth herself. Tom Briggs, an officer with over 20 years of experience, felt that his position and voice were being overshadowed. To him, Elizabeth's reforms seemed like an assault on the veteran generation of officers. A newcomer, barely here a year, thinks she can just change everything? Tom said during a private meeting with Ryan Carter and a few other officers. "We've worked here for decades, and now she's telling us we've been doing it wrong?" Ryan Carter, younger than Tom but equally resistant to change, added, "And what about George? Look at him now, working with kids like some loser. If she can turn George into that, who's next?" Their complaints weren't just grumblings, they reflected a deep frustration at losing control and influence over their work environment. This sense of helplessness drove Tom and Ryan to take action. Tom, leveraging his close ties with some administrative staff, quietly directed them to produce falsified reports about the effectiveness of Elizabeth's reforms. Meanwhile, Ryan reached out to a local journalist he knew, attempting to persuade them to write hit pieces discrediting Elizabeth and tarnishing her reputation. "This is going too far," a younger officer warned Ryan upon learning of the plan. But Ryan dismissed him, saying, "If we don't do something, this entire department will become her playground." Their dissatisfaction extended beyond undermining Elizabeth. It also created a divisive atmosphere within the department. Younger officers who supported the reforms began to feel ostracized and pressured by Tom and Ryan's group. The tension reached its peak when Tom and Ryan decided to exploit a tense confrontation in the community as a tool to weaken Elizabeth's standing. They deliberately manipulated information in a report, making it appear as though the reforms had caused chaos rather than improvements. "When this blows up, she won't be able to cover it up," Tom said confidently to Ryan. But they underestimated Elizabeth's vigilance. Elizabeth, always meticulous, quickly noticed discrepancies in the reports. The data didn't align with what she had observed during her direct interactions with patrol teams and the community. One morning, as she reviewed the reports more closely, she uncovered clear evidence of tampering. Key details had been altered, and original documents were mysteriously missing. Rather than acting impulsively, Elizabeth chose a measured approach. She quietly assembled a trusted team, including young officers and independent investigators, to trace the source of the irregularities. Within a week, the truth emerged. The culprits behind the scheme were identified, and Elizabeth decided to confront them head-on. An emergency meeting was called at the police department. Every officer was present, unsure of the reason for the gathering. Elizabeth entered the room, a file of documents in hand. She wasted no time, beginning with a strong and direct tone. "In recent weeks, I have received falsified reports regarding the effectiveness of our new policies. After an investigation, I've discovered that some among us have deliberately manipulated information and spread false rumors." The room fell into a tense silence. Elizabeth paused, her gaze sweeping across the officers before landing on Tom Briggs and Ryan Carter. Both sat motionless, their faces straining to appear calm, though their eyes betrayed their anxiety. "I did not come here to remove anyone," Elizabeth continued, her voice unwavering. "But if anyone believes that sabotaging from within will make me back down, they are mistaken. Those involved will be held accountable, and I assure you, there will be no cover-ups or leniency." The room remained silent as Elizabeth's words resonated with unmistakable authority. When the individuals responsible were suspended, Tom Briggs and Ryan Carter didn't stop there. Along with a few allies, they discreetly connected with influential figures in local government to pressure Elizabeth into resigning. One morning, Elizabeth received a summons from the city council, demanding an explanation for internal unrest within the police department and controversial policies. She knew this was a move to weaken her position. As Elizabeth entered the meeting room, she could feel the tense atmosphere. Suspicious eyes from the council members fixated on her, while whispers spread among a few people in the corners of the room. "Ms. Carter, do you believe that your reforms, however well-intentioned, are damaging the reputation of the Montgomery Police Department?" one council member asked, raising an eyebrow in a tone heavy with criticism. Elizabeth raised her head, her gaze unwavering. Before responding, she took a deep breath, her words clear and resolute. "No one ever said change would be easy. But if we continue to ignore issues that have persisted for too long, we will never earn the community's trust. I'm not here to protect anyone's reputation. I'm here to uphold justice. Another council member stood, deliberately interrupting her. "And what about the internal conflicts you've caused? A good leader shouldn't be sowing division." Elizabeth looked directly at the speaker, her tone authoritative. "Division doesn't come from reform. It comes from those unwilling to change. I'm ready to take responsibility for my decisions, but I wonder, are we all prepared to take responsibility for our past indifference?" Her words left the room in a heavy silence. George, sitting in the back row, unexpectedly stood. With a firm voice, he added, "Elizabeth Carter has done what none of us dared to do. Face the truth. If anyone claims she's causing division, remember that these changes are restoring Montgomery Police Department's honor and accountability." A smattering of applause broke out, gradually spreading through the room. Elizabeth turned her head, offering George a faint smile. The tension within her began to ease. Maintaining her composure, Elizabeth's gaze was steady as she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that correcting past mistakes requires both courage and determination. If that makes some uncomfortable, then it's the price we pay to build a police force that the community can trust." Her words silenced the room, but shortly after, another council member interjected. "What about reports of internal conflict and the wave of criticism from veteran officers? Do you truly have control over this department?" The question cut sharply, but before Elizabeth could respond, George Miller rose again from the back of the room. Looking directly at the council members, he spoke with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am someone who, a year ago, was burdened with prejudice and mistakes. It was Ms. Carter's reforms that changed me. Without her, I would never have understood the value of building trust with the community. Those opposing these reforms aren't doing so because they're ineffective. They're doing so because they fear losing the power they've grown accustomed to abusing." The room fell into stunned silence at George's declaration. For the first time, Elizabeth allowed herself a soft smile. George's words not only defended her but affirmed the importance of the changes she had brought. After the meeting, the political pressure temporarily subsided, but Elizabeth knew her battle was far from over. She thanked George with a nod, both of them aware that they had become allies in this difficult journey. George, upon learning of the schemes and betrayal by those he once called colleagues, felt a mix of disappointment and awakening. He realized that while he was working to change, there were still those unwilling to let go of their prejudices and old habits. One evening, he visited Elizabeth in her office, his voice more sincere than ever. "I can't believe they did this, but I want you to know, I stand with you." Elizabeth looked at him, nodding lightly but with a determined gaze. "I hope so, George, because change doesn't come from me alone. It comes from all of us." Her words made George understand that to truly make amends, he needed to do more than change himself. He needed to help build a better environment, starting from within the force he had once been so proud to serve. As time passed, Elizabeth Carter's decisive actions and reforms proved their worth, serving as a testament to the effectiveness of her leadership. 1 year later, the Montgomery Police Department had undergone a significant transformation, not only in its operations but also in its relationship with the community. De-escalation training sessions had become an integral part of the officers' schedules. Reports of unnecessary confrontations dropped sharply, replaced by accounts of officers handling situations with greater understanding and calmness. The Community Oversight Committee, once a target of criticism, was now recognized as a vital mechanism for maintaining transparency and trust. Amid this transformation, George Miller stood out as a living testament to the journey from hardship to hope. From a man once hardened and bitter, George had become a completely different person. Working with the community not only helped him recognize the harm he had caused, but also taught him the value of building trust. The months he spent working with children at the community center changed George's perspective. He was no longer just a law enforcement officer, but someone who listened and offered support. Each time he heard a child's story or received a smile from a parent, he felt as though he was making amends for his past mistakes. One day, during a communication skills workshop for teenagers, a boy who had once challenged George with a confrontational question said, "I didn't think you would change, but now I see you have." George looked at the boy and smiled sincerely. "Thank you," he replied. "Change isn't easy, but I think it's worth it." It wasn't just George who experienced growth. The entire Montgomery Police Department underwent a positive transformation. Officers who had once doubted Elizabeth's reforms began to see their true value. They started receiving positive feedback from residents, not the skeptical glances or criticisms of the past, but cooperation and empathy. An elderly woman in the community who had once openly opposed George's participation approached him during a meeting between the police and residents. "I didn't trust you at first," she admitted, "but now I see I was wrong. Thank you for what you've done for the children." Once again, George simply smiled and nodded. To him, words like these were the clearest evidence of his redemption. Elizabeth Carter, always composed and focused, couldn't help but feel proud of the changes within the department she led. She knew that the reforms weren't just the result of strong leadership, but also of collective commitment and effort. One morning, during an internal meeting, Elizabeth addressed the entire police department. "When I came here, I knew that change wouldn't be easy. But you've shown that change is possible when we work together. This is not just my success, it's the success of all of you." George sat in the back row, listening to Elizabeth's words. A profound sense of peace filled him. He no longer felt like a burden or a man being punished, but like a part of something positive and transformative. 1 year wasn't enough to erase all the wounds and prejudices of the past, but it laid a solid foundation for building a better future. George was no longer just a police officer. He had become a friend to the community. He wasn't sure if everyone had forgiven him yet, but he knew he was on the right path. Most importantly, he had learned that it's never too late to change, as long as you're willing to begin. A year later, the changes were no longer confined to the Montgomery Police Department. They had spread throughout the community. To mark this significant milestone, a public forum was held at the City Conference Center. It was a special evening where officers, residents, and city leaders came together to reflect on their achievements and look toward the future. Elizabeth Carter, in her crisp police uniform, stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent, leaving only her calm yet powerful voice to fill the space. "When I took on this position, I knew the work ahead would not be easy," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "We had to confront deep-seated issues that had existed for years, barriers not just between the police and the community, but within ourselves." She paused briefly, allowing her words to resonate. "But one thing I have always believed," she continued, "is that responsibility does not mean perfection. It means acknowledging mistakes and striving to correct them." Elizabeth turned her gaze toward the crowd where George Miller sat quietly in a corner. He wore his police uniform, but his posture was slightly reserved, as if he hoped not to draw attention. "And today," she said with emotion in her voice, "I want to share a vivid example of that. Officer George Miller, who faced his mistakes and chose to change." All eyes immediately turned toward George. He felt his heart race, his hands gripping the edge of his seat tightly. In that moment, memories of his journey, from arrogance and prejudice to small but meaningful progress within the community, played in his mind like a slow-motion reel. Elizabeth continued. George didn't just admit his mistakes, he worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, not only with the community, but with himself. His efforts have shown us that real change is always possible when we are willing to embrace it. Under the watchful gaze of the entire room, George slowly stood. He felt as though every light was shining on him, but this time, instead of feeling judged, he felt recognized. The room erupted into applause. It started as a few scattered claps, but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. George looked around, seeing colleagues and residents who had once distanced themselves now smiling and nodding in support. Elizabeth paused, letting the sound of recognition fill the space. As the applause quieted, she turned to George and said, "Thank you, Officer Miller, for showing us that responsibility and change are the foundation of progress." The forum ended with an atmosphere of hope and unity. As George left the hall, many people approached him to shake his hand and offer congratulations. A boy who had once challenged him at the community center smiled and said, "You did it." George smiled back. "Thank you," he replied, "but I think I still have more work to do." It wasn't just humility, it was the truth. George knew his journey of change wasn't over, and he was ready to keep striving, one day at a time. In the dim evening light, George felt lighter than ever. He was no longer the rigid, prejudiced man he had been a year ago. He was part of the change, not perfect, but sincere and meaningful. The story concluded with George standing on the steps, looking out at the cityscape of Montgomery, his heart filled with hope for a future where trust and understanding would always lead the way. The journey of George Miller and Elizabeth Carter showed us that, no matter how flawed the past may be, change and redemption are always possible if we are willing to face the truth and work for it. From a prejudiced police officer, George had become a man respected by the community, a testament to how remorse and positive action can rebuild lost trust. What do you think about George's journey? Do you believe everyone deserves a chance to change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. See you in the next video.